Good morning and welcome to the 23rd Summer Lecture Series presented by Osher at Dartmouth. I'm Steve Toffel and as of July 1st, became the new president of Osher. This would have been our 24th lecture series, but we had some technical difficulties last summer. And so we are only at number 23. I'm told that there are over 400 of you out there, and I'm in a small room at our new facilities in Lebanon looking into a camera, so things aren't quite back to normal. But at least we're virtually together, and thus begins our return to our new normal. I want to take this opportunity to thank my immediate predecessor, Bill Sullivan, for turning over Osher in such incredibly good shape. Think back to where we were when Bill took over 2 years ago. Our offices were at 7 Lebanon Street in Hanover. Our classes were at the DOC house. And Bill's immediate challenge was to find us a new home. And with the help of many volunteers and staff, that goal was accomplished brilliantly. When you see our new facilities, you'll know what I mean. Bill also helped guide us through COVID. With tremendous support from our staff and the curriculum committee, we emerged from the pandemic stronger than ever. And thank you, Bill. I also want to thank Ann Hargraves and Roland Kutchell and the entire Summer Lecture Series committee, whose names you'll find in your program. Until you've worked to produce a series such as this, you can't imagine the amount of effort that goes into it. So thank you all. I want to thank David Bisno, who was instrumental in starting this program almost 24 years ago. And I also want to remember Bruce McDonald, who left us this past year. Bruce chaired the Summer Lecture Series for 10 years and in a big way helped build it into the institution within Osher that it's become. Bruce has our gratitude, and your wonderful wife, Jan, is in our thoughts. And one more thanks, and this is for what's going to happen very soon. In addition to Zoom classes, we will resume in-person classes in the fall. Thank you, staff. Thank you, curriculum committee, and thank you, members of the Osher Fund, the Friends of Osher Fund, who made this all possible. And now, enough from me. Here's co-chair Ann Hargrave, a former Osher president, to introduce our first speaker. Enjoy the series. Thank you.
Good morning, and welcome to the first lecture in our 2021 series. I am Ann Hargraves. Roland Kutchell and I are co-chairs of the Summer Lecture Series. We owe thanks to the Osher volunteers and staff who have been working for months to make this series possible, and to Dartmouth's conference and events team who have guided us through the technology. We owe thanks also to our underwriters, Caldwell Law, Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Kendall at Hanover, The Village, Wells Fargo Advisors, and to the sponsor for this session, Taylor Cottrill Erickson and Associates. Let's give them a round of applause. Be sure to thank them if you run into them around town. Now, some housekeeping details. We ask that you direct your questions to us through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. We will accept questions during the speaker's presentation and during the 15-minute break. Closed captioning is available. If you would like to turn it on, just click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you encounter technical difficulties, please email osher@dartmouth.edu or call 603-645-0154. Again, those contacts are osher@dartmouth.edu and 603-645-0154. Our speaker this morning is Matt Slaughter, Dean of the Tuck School of Business and Professor of International Business. Matt is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the International Tax Policy Forum, and an academic advisor to the McKinsey Global Institute. Please welcome Matt Slaughter.
And thank you for those very kind and generous words. And good morning. Thanks everyone, the Osher organizers, for inviting me to help kick off this summer series. It's an honor to be here. I'm a big fan of Osher and all the great things that you do for Dartmouth and for the Upper Valley and the broader world. So it's a pleasure to be here. The topic for our morning conversation here on the American dream and the very provocative question of, is the American dream sustainable? I'm really looking forward to discussing with all of us. What I've done is actually I've prepared a set of slides that can walk us through the first part of our conversation. And that'll naturally, I think, lead to some questions. And I really look forward to the conversation that we'll have in the question and answer session after we have gone through this first part. So what I'm going to do actually now is I'm going to share my screen and start off with the presentation, as I said, on this great question in the overall series of what's next, finding a way forward. I think many, if not most of us in this conversation are American citizens, and many, whether or not American citizens, are in the United States. And thinking about this very important phrase of the American dream and whether it's in some sense sustainable, I think it's just a terrific way to kick off your summer series. So again, thank you, Anne, for the kind words. And why don't we just kind of move into the discussion? I like us to think about, is the American dream sustainable, by trying to answer this question in three parts. And the slides that I have here kind of walk us through some of data, what academic and policy research shows, and some of my sentiments about how to answer this question in these three parts. The first thing I want us to do is actually think about different definitions of the American dream, and then kind of match what might be your definition or common definitions of the American dream against the empirical evidence to see whether in some sense that American dream is fading or reviving. And then second, I think once we move through that first part of the conversation, we'll see that the empirical evidence, the data on how American workers, their families, their communities are doing, then in some of these definitions that we commonly think of for this phrase, the American dream, that dream is fading. So I'm going to want us to spend a little bit of time talking through why that seems to be happening, what the academic and policy research seems to show for why the American dream is fading. And then the third most important question, I think, is what might we do about that? What might we do to revive the American dream? And I think naturally this will lead to a lot of great questions and the conversation that we'll have after the break in the second part of our session today. Before we get started, I'll just kind of level set a little bit. I've got a phrase here about me. In addition to Anne's kind words, I'll just say that I am an independent economist Tigger. By that, I mean the following. I'm an independent. I'm a lifetime independent in the United States. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I've continued to do a lot of public policy work, mainly at the federal government level over my career. So today I wear my purple tie, kind of red plus blue equals purple. I'm an economist, both by training, by the work that I do, the outreach that I do. And I think it's important. Economics is not the be all and end all, but I think the notion of the American dream has long been rooted in some sense of economic progress and opportunity. So the numbers that I'm going to share with us, the empirical evidence, a lot of it is based on kind of what the economic data show us. And last thing I'll say, I'm a Tigger. If you remember the Winnie the Pooh stories in the pantheon of characters in the 100-Acre Wood, I tend to be a pretty optimistic person by disposition. I acknowledge that some of the data we're going to talk through in the conversation isn't all that Tiggerish when we look at some of the dimensions and how the American dream seems to be fading rather than reviving. But nevertheless, I think there's always opportunity for leadership in particular to change a lot of the public policies that shape the opportunities that are present for the American dream. So with that as predicate, let's think about this first of the three questions, which is how do you define the American dream? And is it fading or reviving? And it's terrific that you all are reconvening this summer on Zoom. If we were in person, I'd cold call some people and get a sense of what you think the American dream is. But I encourage you to take a moment and what comes to your mind, especially when you think about economic progress and opportunity, for what dimensions of economic well-being do you think are part of the American dream? And then, as I said, we're going to walk through the empirical evidence on whether things seem to be fading or reviving on these different dimensions of economic well-being. There's 5 different dimensions I'm going to walk us through. And for each, I'll have a picture or two that walks us through some data. And I should say at the outset, these slides that I'm using to frame our conversation, I'm very happy to share with everyone at OSHA here. So don't feel if you're interested in some of the numbers that you need to hurriedly try to write them down. These slides, as I've said to Anne and all the organizers, I'm very happy to have everyone have as a part of your learning through the overall summer series. So you can just kind of process the information how you like. And for a lot of people, the first dimension of economic well-being I want us to think about is their earnings in the labor market. For most of us, over our lifetime, unless there's kind of good luck or just some happenstance of life, we work to provide labor income and other types of income to support ourselves, our families, our communities. So I think a lot of us have an idea that the American dream, progress would mean that people's earnings, especially in what economists call inflation-adjusted terms, are growing for workers over time. And the first thing that I want us to see here when we look at the evidence on this one dimension of the American dream is actually not a lot of workers' earnings have been rising, especially in this first roughly 20 years of the 21st century. If you recall John Kennedy and his presidency, he had a few lovely speeches where he used the metaphor of the rising tide lifting all the boats. In my economics lexicon, think of the rising tide as growth in total output, growth in what economists call output per person or labor productivity, and think of the lifting of all the boats as the idea that a lot of workers, maybe not by the exact amount or share, but their incomes in inflation-adjusted terms are rising along with that overall growth in output and productivity. And when we look at this first part of the 21st century, not a lot of people's earnings have been rising in real terms. And I just want to show us some data on that. In the US government data that economists like me like to use that are representative of the overall population, there's one broad measure of earnings in the labor market called total money earnings that we can identify individuals by their educational group, their educational attainment. Educational attainment is not a perfect measure of people's skills and capabilities. We all know, for example, people like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, they dropped out of college. They've done okay in the labor market. But if you want one single measure in the public domain that can give a pretty good overall measure of people's skills, it's educational attainment. Real here means adjusted for price inflation. So over time, as all of us knows, the general level of prices of goods and services can rise. I want us really to focus in terms of well-being on real, that is inflation-adjusted earnings. So the data I'm going to show us here are changes from that overall period of 2000 through 2016. This is still the most recent year for which we have finalized government data on this. What was the cumulative change over those 16 years by educational group in their total money earnings? So let's march up the skills ladder. We'll start with people who have a high school degree or less. Last year, that was about 37.6% of workers in the American labor force. The cumulative inflation-adjusted change in total money earnings for this group was a slight decline of about 0.7%. These are means. If you want to get into the weeds on statistics, I love to do that. We can do that in the Q&A. These are means. If I showed us medians, they'd be quite similar. But here's a boat that wasn't rising. This group, on average, their earnings fell slightly in inflation-adjusted terms over this first generation of the 21st century. We can talk about reasons why, but this is just a reality that here's a large chunk of the American labor force whose earnings weren't rising. Let's keep going. People with some college, with or without a four-year degree, they may have a 2-year associate's degree. The inflation-adjusted earnings change for this group, which is 27% of the labor force, was a decline again, a larger decline of a little over 7%, 7.2%. If you add those first two columns, we've got close to 2/3 of the American labor force whose inflation-adjusted earnings on average were falling, not rising in this first part of the 21st century. And that's not great. I think all else equal, we think about an American dream, we like the idea of people's earnings rising over time. Over most of the 20th century, through hard work or good luck, if you're earned a college degree, your real earnings through almost all parts of the 20th century were increasing quite smartly. But recently, even that hasn't been happening for all people that have at least a college degree. Let's start with people who have just a 4-year college degree, but no advanced degree beyond that. College graduates, 22% of the American labor force, an inflation-adjusted earnings change of a decline again of 4.3%. And if you think about children, grandchildren, people you know, I think we can think of anecdotes of young adults recently in the American labor force in the past decade or two who really have been working hard, but not necessarily getting ahead in the way that some of us might have in earlier decades in the United States. Let's keep going. Non-professional master's degrees, master's in social work, master's in public policy, master's in education, 9.9% of the labor force, and an average earnings change of a decline again of 5.5%. We've got close to 96% of the American labor force here, all of whose average earnings have been falling, not rising, for close to a generation. So this is a sense in which very few boats in terms of labor market earnings have been rising. Who's left? It's the advanced professional degrees of the doctors and the lawyers and the MBA graduates, like those at the Tuck School, a slight earnings increase there of 2.9%. and those who earned a PhD or hold a PhD, a slight earnings increase of 4.3%. So not many people's earnings were rising over most of this first part of the 21st century. And I think when we think about the American dream of progress in the labor market, this isn't great, I think, for most people. If the same underlying data source calculates the income, the total income for households, this is income for workers. If you look at households, median household income, that's the household, if you line everyone up and get that person right in the middle of the income distribution, some of the lowest income households in the Northeast Kingdom or rural Appalachia to some of the highest income, median income in 2019 was $68,703. That was about 10% where it was back in 1999. But when you annualize that increase, it's been going up very slowly by only about 0.5% a year, only about $300 a year. This has been growing in part because more households have both moms and dads or more adults working and trying to work more hours to offset the numbers on this chart. It's also been rising in part because this measure of income for households also captures transfers, fiscal transfers from the government to help people, things like Social Security payments, disability payments. So when we look at labor market earnings, wow, here's a sense where relative to earlier decades in America, I think the American dream on this dimension has actually been fading a bit rather than reviving. Couple of footnotes on this. If you look at the few years before the pandemic hit, again, this data set stops in about 2016, what we did see was stronger earnings growth, which was terrific, especially for the less skilled Americans. So here's some data that one of the investment banks in Wall Street put together, looking into mid-2019 before the pandemic hit. What this chart shows is that wages and non-wage benefits were rising more during this 4-year period for, on average, lower income, lower educational attainment people than for higher income, higher educational attainment people. So that was a positive. And yet, as we all know, the pandemic hit. So one more caveat I want to make to these data that I showed us here was when you look at since the pandemic hit, where the damage has been hardest in the labor market was clearly on the less skilled workers on average. Here's an organization called Opportunity Insights puts together tracking real-time data week by week from some data sources that private sector analysts put together, looking at the decline in employment week by week. And they broke it out here between high wage people, those who earn on average more than $60,000 a year, and low wage people, those who earn less than $27,000 a year. And the key message was the decline in employment that we saw in the aggregate in the United States, if you think back to 12, 18 months ago, clearly hit all workers initially, but hit much harder lower income, less skilled people. And though the labor market has been recovering, even when we get out to today, the total quantity of hours being worked by low wage people in the US economy is still about 20% below where it was before the pandemic hit. Whereas for high income people, it seems like they're actually working more in total in the US economy than they were before the pandemic. So clearly the pandemic has played a force when we think about a lot of these issues, and that may be one of the topics that we want to talk about. But on this first dimension of labor market earnings, boy, I think we'd like to see something different to have a sense that the American dream is really thriving. Some of you, when I asked that question, let's go to a second measure of how we define the American dream. I think it's in terms of not income that you earn year in year in the labor market, but the wealth, the net worth that you have overall. So I think for some of us, we'd love to think that the American dreams means that your wealth over time of workers and of families is growing. That wealth allows us, the savings that helps feed into the wealth that we have, allows us to fund things like higher education for our children and our grandchildren. It allows us to offset, healthcare costs and things like that. It allows us to make bequests to our children and our grandchildren. So I think we'd like to be in a society where for lots of American workers and their families, wealth is rising a lot. Again, if we look at the first generation of the 21st century, we see something quite similar for wealth as we did for income, which is not a lot of boats, if you will, in terms of wealth have been rising. Let's look at the data on this. Every 3 years, the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, conducts a survey where they survey households on their assets and their debits, on their liabilities. So what assets they may own, like homes that they own, stock accounts, savings accounts, checking accounts, and they offset that to calculate net worth against what liabilities they may have, loans outstanding, mortgages, credit card debt. So they do this every 3 years, and they break out the data. There's about 130 million households in America today, they break out the data so we can look at the distribution by quartiles, by every roughly 30 million households. So what I want to show us is from 2001 to 2019, again, in inflation adjusted dollars, so in 2019 dollars, that mean the average net worth of US households marching up the distributional ladder. So let's start with the bottom quartile of American households. And I'm showing here their net worth in 2001 and in 2019. The way to read this is in 2001, the mean net worth of the bottom quartile of households in America was about $100. In 2019, that mean net worth for this bottom quartile of households in America had actually fallen to slightly negative, to negative $13,600. So that typical household had more, say, revolving credit card debt, payday loans, title loans, other vehicles than they did in assets and checking, savings accounts, and other assets. So here's a group whose net worth was actually declining over this first part of the 21st century. Let's keep going. The next quartile, mean net worth in 2001, $64,200. By 2019, for this group too, it had declined slightly to $58,200. Let's keep going. The next quartile going up to the 75th percent. Again, a slight decline over this generation from $241,800 to just $236,300. It's not until you get up into that last quartile, the higher net worth individuals, and especially the top 10th, that you see increases rather than decreases in inflation adjusted net worth over this generation. So again, the second dimension of economic well-being in the American dream of wealth increasing over time, boy, in the past generation, that hasn't been happening for a lot of households, even though, as some of you may know, total net worth has been rising. It hasn't been rising a lot for the majority of households in America. If I look at the median household in America, we looked at the median household for income a few slides ago. The median household net worth in 2019 was $121,800. That was actually slightly below where it was in 2001. The median net worth then was about $125,000. And as you might recall, there was a peak in terms of the valuation of housing in America before the world financial crisis a little over 10 years ago. So on the second measure of net worth, when we think about well-being in the American dream, boy, we see kind of like with incomes in the labor market, that net worth hasn't been rising for a lot of households. Some of you, when you thought about a definition of the American dream, you might have thought actually across generations, not just how individual workers or families are progressing through time, but thinking about extended families. I think for a lot of us, those of us who are fortunate enough to have children or have loved ones who have children, nieces, nephews, or just friends, oftentimes people think about the American dream over a longer time horizon of children faring better economically than parents. And I think a lot of us who have kids, we have that hope for our children. And for a long time in America, that was happening for the large majority of Americans in the stories that we would tell. Recently, some wonderful academic economists and scholars have allowed us to really track this systematically by looking at tax return data. As you might recall, when you file your federal income taxes every year, if you have dependents, you list your social security number and the social security number of your children. And some wonderful scholars painstakingly in recent years have pieced together families through generations based on those tax return data to be able to look at how children fare economically compared to their parents. And this next chart shows, I think, one of the most surprising dimensions of how the American dream seems to be fading, which is fewer and fewer children seem to be doing better than their parents when they grow up. This chart shows earnings of children compared to their parents. So this will take a minute to explain. What these scholars did, which is remarkable, was they looked at birth cohorts in America. They looked at every child born in America in 1940, 1941, all the way up to 1984. So like I was born in 1969, so I'm in this group here. And then what they did using social security numbers was they looked out for every child born in that year and said when they turned 30, what was their earnings in the labor market when they were 30 years old? And then they compare back to the earnings of their parents when they were born. And they adjust for price inflation again. And they asked a very simple question, which is what percentage of the children born in each of these years in America, when they turned 30, was earning more in inflation adjusted terms than their parents were? Now, there's a whole bunch of interesting statistical issues that to generate this figure. For example, were mom and dad both working when a child was born? So there's ways that these scholars accounted for how you calculate the earnings of your parents compared to you when you were an adult at the age of 30. So the way to read this is, of children born in America in 1940, when they had turned 30 years old in 1970, 92% of them, that dot represents 92%, were earning more than their parents were in the year they were born in 1940. And I think most of us like the idea that children, when they mature to young adulthood, are doing better in the labor market than their parents were. I think that's a commonly thought definition of the American dream. But what this chart shows is that over time, a pretty steady decline in the share of children in America once they reach young adulthood who are earning more than their parents. That 92% had fallen to, by the time the 1984 birth cohort had got to 30, had fallen to just 50%. So what we're seeing in America is a declining share of young adults by the time they've grown up and have gotten most, if not all, of the formal education and training they ever will have. A declining share of them were earning more than their parents were. So if this is a dimension of the American dream that really matters to you, here's another dimension where it seems to be fading rather than reviving. Two other dimensions we'll quickly look at. Some of us think about our communities, not just families, but the communities in which we live. And I think a lot of us like the idea that our communities across the country, that in some economic sense, they're coming together over time. There's more opportunity, more income, more wealth, more ways that communities are thriving economically. That's, I think, a dimension for a lot of people when they think about the American dream. It's not just themselves, not just their families, but the communities in which they live. And yet, this next chart shows that when we look over time, economic performance, and here this summary I'm giving is talent, the share of college graduates in given communities, is actually getting more concentrated in fewer locations in America rather than dispersing more evenly. That's a real change compared to most of the 20th century, where in a lot of measures, where skilled workers were going, where income was being generated, where new businesses were being generated, was spreading out more evenly across space, across our 50 states, across communities. But this chart is a summary for actually in the past roughly 30, 40 years, where talent and economic vibrancy is happening in America is becoming more concentrated, not less concentrated. This chart shows there's 53 what are called MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas in the United States in recent years that have at least 1 million people or more in terms of their population. This chart is a simple scatter that shows for all 53 MSAs in America, what fraction of their labor force had a college degree or higher in 1980, so 10% to 30%. And then over the next roughly 40 years, we had data to do this for 36 years, what was the change in the share of labor force in that community that was college educated? And this gentle upward slope represented by this line shows that the initially more talented, more economically vibrant communities were gaining more talent and more economic vibrancy over the past 30, 40 years. A few are picked out here. I'll come back to talk about this later, like Seattle. These real outliers of high initial vibrancy and fast growth and vibrancy over the past couple of generations. These include Boston, San Francisco, San Jose, Washington, DC are some of the other cities that are represented here. So when we think about how our communities are doing as a possible dimension of the American dream, boy, things are becoming more unequal across communities, not less equal. And the fifth and final dimension of the American dream that some of you might have thought of, I want to touch upon, and we can definitely come back to in the discussion, is racial disparities. I think especially in the pandemic with the increased focus on systemic racism in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of us have become more aware of the ongoing issues of racial inequality in the United States. And so for many of us, I think an American dream thriving is set in some sense a notion that racial disparities in economic performance are closing over time rather than widening. Again, when we go and look at the data though, we see something quite different. If you look, for example, at what's called the black-white pay gap in the economics literature, if anything, that gap has been flat to slightly widening over the past few decades rather than shrinking. A couple of great economists this chart comes from, one of whom is a friend of mine, Kerwin Charles. He's down at Yale. He's actually my peer, the dean at the Yale School of Management. He and a co-author calculated the ratio of the earnings of Black men in America compared to white men in America. And they looked at everyone in the labor force, whether they were employed or not, and their earnings, the average earnings, again, this shows what the average earnings of a Black man each year was in the US labor force compared to white men. And what you see is over the 40s, 50s, into the 60s and 70s, that gap was closing. But then we got to about 1970 or 1980 in these measures, and that gap has barely budged. And if anything, for example, when you look at all men in the labor force, whether they're working full-time or part-time or not, that gap of 59% in 1970 was actually slightly worse at 56% in 2019. And if we look at net worth, as some of you may know, if you read the data, if you look at net worth in America by the race and ethnicity of the head of the household, there's shocking disparities that have been quite persistent through time. In 2019, the data we were looking at net worth a few minutes ago, the federal government breaks out those data by ethnic and racial groups by the head of the household. The median net worth of white-headed households in 2019 was $188,200. That was 7.8 times the median net worth of black-headed households, which was just $24,100 in 2019. So when we think about racial disparities, wow, we don't see obvious, clear, ongoing progress in the ways that a lot of us would think of when we think about the American dream. So this slide here summarizes all that whirlwind of data that we just went through. And if you love data, great. If you don't, that's fine. I think it's important, though, to understand that by many common definitions that focus on economics, the American dream has been fading, or at best is not expanding or reviving in ways that most of us think about when we speak about the American dream. So let's spend a few minutes thinking about, well, what are the consequences of a fading American dream? Again, I don't think the economics is the be all and end all, but for a sense of human well-being, for families, for communities, economic well-being drives a lot of overall human well-being. And very tragically, what we've seen in the United States as other consequences of the fading American dream has a lot to do with the basic health of our fellow citizens. In many parts of the country, one of the consequences that has been documented of a fading American dream is rising, what a couple of economists, Angus Deaton and his wife Ann Kay, termed deaths of despair. I won't read all these words, but what you see is that America's suicide rate has increased quite dramatically over the past 10, 20 years in the United States, and in particular locations where on a lot of the measures we were just looking at, some of the economic pressures have been the most acute. And so what Anne and Angus have dubbed tragically these deaths of despair, they've done a lot of compelling research that shows individuals and families and communities where these economic pressures have been growing. People seem to have more challenges moving through their day-to-day lives. And oftentimes, either through substance abuse or suicide, we seem to see an increase in what I call these deaths of despair. And in fact, if you read today's New York Times or any, the Journal, Washington Post, there's a lot of commentary today. The US government just yesterday put out drug overdose deaths for the year 2020, and they rose by nearly 30% last year to a record 93,331 individuals. So this is a chart I took from the New York Times today that shows there's been this ongoing rise in drug overdose deaths, plateaued a little bit, but the economic and societal and life pressures of the pandemic has tragically sparked this real leap in deaths of despair. And now in terms of suicides, this peak here, this is drug overdose deaths, far exceeds the highest level of deaths the US ever saw from car crashes, from HIV, or from gun violence. So again, one of the dimensions of these deaths of despair, which is substance abuse, seems to tragically continue to be its march upward. So that's, I think, an important consequence of the fading American dream. And more generally, I'll just spend a minute because this will touch upon the public policy discussion. Another, I think, consequence of this clearly from the political science and economics academic literature is in some broad sense, the sense of confidence and hope in the United States is actually been fading rather than reviving. So I'm going to show us a few what political scientists call thermometer questions. These are ways to gauge the sentiment of Americans that are well represented and well researched. One is to ask, do you think a nation is in a state of decline? Do you feel that's not the case? The last time the Wall Street Journal and NBC asked this question was several years ago now, in 2014. Maybe they'll ask it again next month. But by nearly a 2-to-1 ratio, Americans said, I think the country's in a state of decline rather than not in a state of decline. Another common thermometer question is to use a railroad metaphor and ask people, do you think that the United States is on the right track or the wrong track? I went back and looked in the Real Clear Politics an online aggregator of different surveys. The Real Clear Politics average across some different surveys of this right track, wrong track question right before the presidential election several months ago. Again, by almost a 2-to-1 ratio, 61% said America's on the wrong track, only 32% said on the right track. And one of the real evocative ways to ask people about their sentiments and confidence is don't ask them about themselves, ask them about their children. Do you feel confident or not confident that life for our children's generation will be better than it has been for us? Again, the Wall Street Journal and NBC, they fortunately have been asking this question for many decades. So I went back and looked at the data going all the way back to the early 1990s and 2001, when the United States at these points in time, as some of you might recall, was coming out of a slight recession. What was striking was even coming out of the recession of 1990 and 2001, it was still the case that more Americans were confident than Americans were not confident that life for our children was going to be better, even in those business cycle downturns. But what we see in more recent years, given some of the ongoing secular pressures that I just talked about, that we walked through on these different dimensions of economic well-being, people are much less confident about the future for their children. August of 2014, only 21% of Americans said they were confident that our children's generation will be better than it has been for us. 76% said not confident. And the last time the Journal NBC asked this was August of 19. So strong labor market performance in some measures that we looked at in recent years, but it was still the case that only 27% of Americans in August of 2019 said they were confident that life for our children's generation will be better than it has been for us. So again, I'm a Tigger by disposition, and I think there's a lot of opportunity this presents for the United States in terms of doing some things differently. But I think based on the economic dimensions of this very important question you all have asked, which is, what's the state of the American dream? I think on a lot of the basic economic measures that matter as part of that American dream, rather than it really being reviving and being vibrant, it's been fading. And that's something that I think should concern all of us, regardless of our political affiliation otherwise. Let's take a few minutes, not a lot, but to just talk about why this seems to be happening. Why is the American dream fading? And what I want to do by looking at just a few pictures, 3 pictures, and looking at one labor market in particular, is summarize for you what literally is at this point thousands of academic research studies and peer-reviewed journals and policy journals. Next week, you're all going to have David Autor, who truly is one of the world's premier labor economists, who's done some of the seminal work on trying to understand some of the wage pressures and divergences that we looked at in particular and issues of jobs. So it's great David's going to be part of the series this summer. But I'm going to summarize all that with just thinking about one particular labor market and think about the anecdotes that we know for what explains what the academic and policy research has showed. So I want us to take a minute and look at this labor market. And I'm not going to tell us which one it is for a moment, and think about why in this labor market, these are again, inflation adjusted earnings, so real earnings. Here's a labor market from 1982. This is a research project I was working on many years ago, but to be honest, serving as dean, I had to set it aside. So the data run through 2007. This is the median earnings. Pick out the average worker in this labor market in terms of the lineup of their overall earnings. Their earnings in this labor market, it's a high talent labor market, rose by about 7 times, from about $100,000 over the 80s into the 90s. It crept up to about $200,000. And then the mid 90s, it started to take off and risen to almost $700,000. And I went and did some eyeball calculations last night. I think today, this number would be about $1.2 to $1.3 million, kind of the typical earnings of the median worker in this labor market. And again, if we were in person, I'd cold call some people and ask what high talent labor market in the US economy is this? I think a lot of people would say things rightly like investment bankers, lawyers, consultants, all good answers, all wrong. It's actually individuals who are on the PGA Tour, the Professional Golf Association Tour in the United States. This is men only, it's not the LPGA. So now I'm not a good golfer. I enjoy playing, but thank goodness I don't have to make a living at it. But those of you who play golf, I want us just to think a little bit about what was going on in the PGA Tour and in our world that explains this remarkable ongoing increase in the returns to these workers. And in particular, I've got this question here. Do you think that these earnings are rising because of increases in the inherent talent of these golfers, or because of increases in the returns to that inherent talent? Those are 2 subtle but quite important differences to understand why the American dream seems to be fading in some ways. So for those of you who know golf, if you don't, just humor me for 1 minute. Think back to this period before here of the, say, the 60s, 70s into the early 80s. And we had world-renowned historic golfers like Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer and Gary Player, who were on the PGA Tour. That, you know, Jack Nicklaus, over his career, won 18 majors. He's got 5 green jackets from Augusta. Do we think that the typical golfer today is 7 times more talented than Jack Nicklaus was, or Arnold Palmer, or Gary Player? That's a very leading question. The answer is no. And what's striking about golf that's great, and this was part of the research, is you can measure the kind of raw talent of golfers with things like their average shots per round or driving distance. And so there's a lot of very tangible, visible measures that you can show. It's not the case that a golfer on the PGA Tour today is 7 to 10 to 12 times as talented as Jack Nicklaus or Gary Player. So maybe talents have gone up some, but what's driving a lot of this increase in income for people who are very talented is increases in the returns to their talent. Think about what has happened with globalization and technological change in particular. During this time period, world demand for golf services, if I frame it that way, has exploded dramatically. We've had billions of people in China and in India meaningfully become part of the global economy, both because those countries have made policy liberalizations to accede into the global economy, in part because of technology changes. The creation of the internet back in 1982, if you wanted to see how things went in around, we got to watch a few hours of broadcast TV on one of the 3 major networks. And if you missed it, you had to wait till the newspaper hit your doorstep the next morning to see the scores. Now, thanks to the internet and social media, you can track any player in real time, shot by shot. The first round of the British Open's going on this morning, and some of you may be peeking at the scores there. So technological change, both in terms of how the players play, they now have access to swing coaches and physios and trainers, and every one of their shots can be tracked in terms of performance and videoed and broken down. The ability to increase talent is part of this, but through technological change and globalization, the ability to scale and generate bigger returns to talent is what's driving a lot of this increase in earnings and wealth for these very high talent individuals. That skewness of growth in income and wealth that we saw in some of the earlier slides, think of these golfers as a summary statistic for the interplay between globalization and technological change, increasing the returns to those who, through hard work or good fortune, are very, very talented. So part of what's explaining the fact that the American dream seems to be thriving for a very small fraction of people in the United States and certain communities has to do with why the PGA Tour earnings have taken off like this. And if you think about similar high talent labor markets, partners in law firms are on Wall Street, hedge fund managers, the scalability and therefore the increase in returns to their talent has exploded dramatically, again, because of technology, innovation, and globalization. The other thing I want us to think about is, okay, that helps explain what's going on with the American dream for very high talent individuals. What about the talent and or what economists call the human capital, the talent and knowledge and capabilities in our minds that we carry to allow us to do work and earn income and wealth? What's been happening in terms of how much America is investing in human capital of all Americans, not just the very high talent people? And here I wish I could tell you that, especially when we look at our school system in America, boy, we've been investing smarter and more, and the underlying talent of children in particular has been growing over time. But on a lot of the measures that educators look at, that simply has not been happening. The OECD is a collection of dozens and dozens of mainly high-income countries around the world. Every 3 years, they conduct something called the PISA, which is an international assessment, the program of international assessment of academic performance, where they take representative samples of children around the world for dozens and dozens of countries at different age levels, like 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade approximately, and they test them on reading, on math, and science. And this is a chart that shows for children in America, their average reading scores, the mean scores in reading, on average, the kids at the 10th percentile in terms of how they scored, and the kids at the 90th percentile. And the message I want you to see here is here's a generation that we've been looking at where the average reading scores for kids in America have barely budged. If anything, kids at the lower percentile in terms of their educational attainment and their scores are slightly fallen, and a little bit of a tick up for the higher performing kids. But if I got out some fancy statistics, 643 is probably statistically the same as 636. So the message I want to communicate with this one example is part of what's going on with the fading American dream is we simply are not continuing to build human capital in our children through schooling, for workers at different life stages, in a way that in earlier generations, and frankly, in much of the 20th century, we were doing in a very consistent way. A lot of measures of human capital and talent development across America were growing consistently over, not all, but many parts of the 20th century. If you know your history, go all the way back to in the early first generation of the 1900s, the states across America deciding that secondary education was going to be made universal and funded by the state. And then think of the GI Bill, and some of you in this conversation may have been recipients of the GI Bill. Your ability to go to college at a much lower cost than was the case helped accelerate college attainment in the labor force in the post-World War II decades. But on a lot of measures, we as a country have simply plateaued in terms of developing the talent, the human capital for many, many of our workers, many of our families, and many of the communities as a result. At a time where a lot of other sovereign nations, like we've talked about, India, China, many other nations around the world that are becoming part of the global economic system, are making investments to expand the talents and capabilities of their students. So part of what globalization means for the American dream is not just what we do here in the United States, it's what we're doing relative to other countries that oftentimes helps determine, like we talked about with golfers, the economic opportunities and the American dream's economic dimensions for workers and for families and communities. So my one slide summary that I think is the accurate answer to the second question I asked, which is why is the American dream fading? The answer is here. The American dream is fading economically because of this interplay between insufficient building of talent, we just looked at that for kids, and these skewed returns to very high talented individuals. That complex interplay of what we're doing or not doing in building human capital in our schools, ongoing technological change, different dimensions of globalization like trade and immigration. Again, this slide summarizes thousands and thousands of academic and policy studies over the past 10, 20 years to try to understand why the American dream seems to be fading. And again, huge shout out to David. I know him, he's a friend. He's going to be able to talk about some of these issues in greater detail with you all in next week's session about jobs and about income, which will be terrific. In the about 10 minutes we have before we take a break, I want us to spend a little bit of time, and again, I'm a Tigger, so the question now is to think about how might we revive the American dream? What might we do as a country? So I want us to, I'm going to think about what public policy could do. There's different dimensions of what the answer to this question might be, which is what might we do in our families or in our local communities. That's important. I'm very happy to talk about that in the discussion as well. But I want to focus our thoughts on answering this question in part about what we at the federal government do, what public policies we might do. First, I'll just say sometimes people, when they're confronted with say, they kind of throw up their hands and say, you know what, don't worry. And in particular, don't worry because technology solves everything. There's this ongoing progress through innovation and discovering new ideas and new technologies. And we should just, maybe we haven't had enough technology innovation in recent times, but don't worry about it. We all love technology, and that's going to solve our problems that we were talking about the fading American dream. And here I will just say, it's not quite as simple as that. And the reason is people understand, Americans are very sophisticated pocketbook voters. They're aware of these economic pressures on the American dream we've been discussing. And they recognize that part of what's driving these pressures is technology innovation that favors very, very skilled people and sometimes is neutral to pressuring moderately little less skilled people. And you see this, I'm going to show us the survey results from a recent survey that asked people about new technology innovations. And the message is the majority of Americans actually don't think these technology innovations are going to be a good thing for jobs and workers. Do you think that having machines with the ability to think for themselves will help or hurt jobs in the economy? And here what you see is by a 72 to 19% crosstab, the large majority of Americans say, a kind of AI, autonomous or artificial intelligence machines, as they're oftentimes called, are actually going to hurt rather than help jobs in the economy. Similar question, robotic nurses for bedridden patients that can diagnose situations and decide when to administer medicine. Boy, when you look at error rates in hospitals, it's remarkable how error rates are much higher during the nighttime. And that reflects in part just the human nature, which is even the most earnest doctors, nurses, orderlies, they're tired and their biorhythms may be off and they might not be as sharp thinking during the nighttime. So these types of innovations might help cut down on human error. And yet 65 to 31, Americans think these types of robotic nurses would be a bad idea rather than a good idea. And the third example that this survey asked was something we hear a lot about in the news, which is self-driven delivery trucks or vehicles. Here too, 67%, only 29%, Americans think this would be a bad idea rather than a good idea. And part of the reason is, of the roughly 135 million payroll jobs in America today, about 4 to 5 million people, it depends on the exact definition of the jobs, but 4 to 5 million Americans, they woke up today and the main thing they do for their job is drive some sort of vehicle. That includes delivery trucks, that includes livery limos, that includes school buses. So Americans today, given the fading American dream pressures that we've talked about, when they asked about innovation, this is quite different from earlier generations. They're more wary of unbridled innovation, unbridled globalization. They want something more to go along with that. So what might that be? I'll just share some of the things that I've thought about and written about over the years. And again, what you might think are the right policy solutions by all means might be different, but I'm encouraging us to think about what we could do at the federal level in addition to other ways to help revive the American dream. Many years ago, I wrote an essay. I worked in the US government for a couple of years. I had the honor of working in the White House. And that was the first time I realized the skewness of income growth for workers that I showed us actually in one of a few minutes ago. And when I left government, I came back here to Tuck in Dartmouth. And in 2007, I wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs that said we need to have large fiscal transfers, meaning we need to use our tax and spending system to offset these emerging income inequality pressures. And I'm not going to read all these words right now. I just have them as a reference for later if you want. But the research was starting to show very clearly that people in America were becoming more protectionist. They were becoming more desiring of building walls to the rest of the world rather than building bridges to the rest of the world. And that's because people were starting to realize their incomes, most people were starting to fall in the way that we looked at. So my policy proposal was, I said we need to have sort of a new deal for globalization. My co-author and I proposed a large tax cut on the payroll tax. If you know the payroll tax, most of us pay income taxes when we're workers, but there's a flat tax called the FICA tax or the payroll tax. It's actually quite regressive. We proposed eliminating the FICA tax on the bottom 50% of workers in the US, have it be revenue neutral, increase the payroll tax on the top 50% of earners. And I like the idea. I think my mom might be with us. My mom liked the idea. Hi, Mom. But like people in Washington generally thought we were nuts. They said either that's crazy, we don't need it, everything's fine. Well, not to say we were prescient at all dimensions, but nothing happened and time ticked along and the American dream continued to fade in ways that we talked about. And someone came along who told a very different plan for how to revive the American dream. It wasn't Secretary Clinton. No disrespect against Secretary Clinton. I voted for in the 2016 presidential election. This picture to me is worth 1,000 words because it described why Donald Trump was elected president. It's not meant to be partisan. Here's a picture though from August of 2016 at a Hillary Clinton rally. And what you see is people supporting Hillary t-shirts, but the faces for most of the people listening are pretty sober, pretty grim. When you look at Donald Trump's path to electoral victory in 2016, the counties that he carried to win the Electoral College on many of the measures we've been talking about were counties in America that have been experiencing a lot of the economic pressures and arguably are counties where the American dream has been fading most dramatically in the past 10, 20, 30 years. And so to me, Donald Trump told a very different story for the American dream. And he heralded that very clearly in his inaugural address. If you go back, if you never read or watched his inaugural address in 2017, I encourage you to do so as a learning exercise. Again, I will not read this text, but this is an excerpt from his presidential text. And it was a very dark message, but one different that said, I know that the American dream is fading, and I know that globalization is playing a role, and I'm going to build walls. From this moment on, it's going to be America first. We've made other countries rich while the wealth, strength, and confidence of our country has disappeared over our borders. And he said, I'm going to build walls. He tried to do that literally and metaphorically. That was a story that resonated with a lot of Americans because they were seeing and perceiving their American dream fading and they wanted something different. I'm a firm believer actually that globalization on average and in total provides immense benefits to the United States. One dimension of that, our terrific international students here at the Tuck School and all of Dartmouth, they enrich the learning environment. My international born faculty colleagues with their great research and great teaching enrich the learning environment. America would be a poor nation overall if we did not have high talent immigrants coming in to help generate dynamism in America. And a lot of research shows that that dynamism can spread quite broadly throughout the country. And yet, not every single worker, family, and community benefit from these pressures of globalization and technological change. We've been talking about that. So if you ask me more recently what to do, I believe what we need to do, it's not just fiscal transfers that we need. We actually need to be investing a lot more in the human capital, in the talents of people in America. So I wrote another essay with this colleague, Ken Sheevy, a few years ago in Foreign Affairs. This was the opening paragraph of that essay, saying we live in this time of protectionist backlash. Donald Trump, consistent with what a lot of Americans were hearing and wanting, was trying to build walls to the rest of the world to help revive the American dream. And our argument was, no, we need to do something quite different. We need to make a national investment in building a new, what we call lifelong ladder of opportunity, where we would expand the human capital, the talent of every single American at very different critical life stages. Because that would allow people to have more opportunity if they could climb up this new ladder of opportunity, to have the skills, the talents to thrive with all these dynamic forces that have been putting pressure on too many Americans, their sense of the dream. Our proposal, quite simply, we said the first thing we should do is every single child in America from birth through kindergarten should have a whole spectrum of early childhood education programs provided for them at no expense to those families. Recent research shows the immense private and social returns to investing in very early childhood human capital development. Studies that show the predictive power, for example, of the number of unique words that a child hears by the time they turn age 5 or 6 is hugely predictive of their success in school and early success in the labor market. The second rung of our ladder of opportunity, we said, should be federal funding for 2 years of community college for every high school graduate who's not going on to pursue a bachelor's degree, to ensure that every young adult in America has at least an associate's degree. The economic case for this is very clear. The returns to a 2-year associate's degree are quite high compared to just a high school degree. And this should be something that the federal government funds. And then the third one we proposed was a lifetime training scholarship. We said that every worker in America who does not have a 4-year college degree, and today that's about 100 million Americans, almost exactly, it's about 100.4 million Americans in the labor force today do not have a 4-year college degree or higher. Our proposal was every 10 years, so once a decade in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, they should be eligible, their employer, for a $10,000 tax credit, where we don't say what exactly the firm would do to provide human capital development for the person, but the firm would get a $10,000 tax credit. All these proposals together would cost the federal government about $250 billion a year. Or in the current parlance, if you score that in the 10-year window, that would be about $2.5 trillion. That's a large investment, we acknowledge. It's about over three times the current funding for the entire Department of Education. But my point of view is quite strong, which is the magnitude of investment needed is large to address the magnitude of the fading of the American dream. And I won't go into detail, but the work that Ken Sheevy and I did underpinning this proposal showed that part of what we need and that this investment will build is actually the civic virtue of more trust. America, as the American dream has been fading, has become a much less trustful citizenry on all the measures that sociologists and political scientists look at. This sort of dramatic and meaningful investment would help rebuild trust in America. We could talk about this in the break if you want. This chart is a little complicated, I won't explain it. And the other thing that we like is when you look at Americans in recent times, actually, they're more open to the idea of building more bridges to the rest of the world, not walls, but bridges. Actually, in recent years, more Americans than not say that trade actually presents an opportunity for growth in America rather than a threat. And for the first time ever, more Americans in recent years would like to increase the level of immigration rather than decrease it. So in ways we don't fully understand, despite President Trump being elected and his argument for building walls, we see Americans recognize globalization and technological change can be good, but they want it to be linked with ladders of opportunity. We're gonna have to pay for that somehow. We've been running massive federal deficits in the United States. We could talk about that in the break if we want. We're going to have to find the political will for this. Those of you who think we should pay more in federal taxes, that's great. I would ask for a show of virtual hands. If you want to pay more in federal taxes than you are legally obligated to do, that's great. You can go to this website and you can make a donation to the federal government to offset the debt. There's a fund called the U.S. Treasury Bureau of the Public Debt. My wife, Lindsay, and I, not to sound sanctimonious, we've been doing this for over 10 years because we think we don't pay enough in federal taxes. But our tax return person said when the first year we did it, like, what? I've never heard of this. And actually, technically, it counts as a charitable deduction, charitable contribution. Not a lot of folks do this. In fiscal 18, that fund raised not even $1 million. But again, I'm a Tigger. We can always have leaders who come along that will inspire us to do things like this. So I think reviving the American dream is going to require bold leadership to build a new lifelong ladder of opportunity for every American at all ages. I don't think that's going to be enough. We're going to need to do more than that. But I just want to seed the conversation with this as I think a foundational idea. And a big question is, will our country summon the will for this and more changes that will help revive the American dream? I'm an independent Tigger. I really hope so. And I really appreciate your attention thus far. And I look forward to talking about all these issues after the break.
Welcome back to the Summer Lecture Series 2021. I'm Roland Kuschel with Anne, a co-chair of the Summer Lecture Series. Our moderator for this session is Jim Wilson, a member of the Summer Lecture Series Committee. Jim has taught economics for over 50 years, including numerous OSHA courses that have focused on the causes and impact of income and wealth disparities in the United States. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Roland. I trust everyone enjoyed their virtual cookie break. I think most of the viewers will agree that young people growing up today face a very different future than most of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s. And Matt, I thought you did a terrific job describing some of the critical changes that have occurred in the past 40 years that have made fulfilling the American dream quite challenging for millions of Americans. Much of the national angst about our future, involving issues like immigration and technology and globalization and race and political dysfunction, are all topics that are going to be part of the Summer Lecture Series. They really are an outgrowth of the changes that you've described. I believe having this discussion about income inequality and the American dream is a perfect jumping off point for this entire series of what's next. The question and answer session is my favorite part of the series. And since we have Matt chained to his desk for the next 40 minutes, let's jump in. It seems to me that Europe has experienced many of the changes that you've described, particularly with regard to technology and globalization. And so while it's clear that these systemic and structural changes have exacerbated the income gap, to what extent is this growing economic divide the result of actions taken by people in power, especially in politics, such as tax policies, spending, or regulatory policies?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Jim. And I was scanning the Q&A that people had put in the before. So thanks for all the great questions. I look forward to getting into a lot of them. I'd say yes and no, meaning I'll start with no. So when you look to Europe around other sovereign nations, not in exactly the same way that we saw for the United States and the numbers that we walked through, but you see in many, many advanced countries around the world, and even some emerging markets as well, moderate low income, the same pressures of kind of poor economic performance relative to the past in terms of labor market income, wealth growth in a lot of other countries like we see in the United States. So that's a no in the sense that there's not, a lot of this is being driven by deep economic forces of opening to the rest of the world. Now, part of that has to do with policy, acknowledged. Countries choose to bring down barriers that restrict the flow of people and capital and ideas and talent and so forth. But a lot of those innovations of globalization are technology related as well. The creation of long distance travel, containerized shipping, air travel innovations, for example. And a lot of the globalization is driven by just smart entrepreneurs in their garages. I mean, the creation of the internet, the creation of Apple and Facebook and Google, these types of companies. So I think a lot of the forces that have been dynamically hitting and changing the US economy have been hitting other countries as well. That's the no. The yes I heard in the question is, what we do see around the world is different sovereign nations making very different policy choices about how to respond to the ongoing forces of globalization and technological change. And your question asked about Europe. If I look at the Scandinavian countries in particular, take Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they're countries that are very exposed to a lot of the forces of globalization and technological change like the United States. In fact, on many measures, they're even more open to these forces that have been driving what we talked about for the American dream. And yet at the same time, they choose to have much more extensive fiscal programs where they raise a lot more revenue and spend it on a lot more supports so individuals and families and communities can respond to and hopefully thrive amidst those dynamic forces. So one measure, we might talk about this more, I'll just say is, if you look at total federal government spending as a share of gross domestic product, of output, of GDP, that's a common measure for kind of the collective political economy of a society for how large of a state they want to have. And this goes back to the classic political economy of Plato and Socrates and all that. The US, compared to most other nations, definitely most European nations, is a small government country. At the federal level, spending in recent years in taxes is about 20% of GDP, give or take. In some of the Nordic nations, it's a little north of 50% of GDP. They have a national sales tax, which the US doesn't, except for certain goods like gasoline and cigarettes. So they have a large value-added tax that explains part of the difference. And they tend to spend those resources on a lot of programs to build human capital and provide kind of safety nets to offset the pressures of globalization, which is why many of those nations, I would point out, there's much more agreement about the values of innovation and globalization than the fractiousness we have here.
Have they suffered from an efficiency and productivity point of view? That's an argument you often hear, that if the government begins to take too large a role, then economic growth and efficiency and productivity will decline.
Yeah, it depends. Great question. And it depends, again, on what those revenues being raised, what they're being spent on. And I come back to my focus and my encouragement to think about a foundation for reviving the American dream is a much more rigorous and expansive building of talent, of human capital. The societies that are investing a lot in the human capital, they're very dynamic, high productivity societies as well. Now, granted, some of them are very small nations, but you look at Norway, you look at Denmark, you look at Sweden, they have extensive investments in high quality public education at the primary, secondary, and even tertiary levels. They have extensive investments in ongoing worker training. Those are kind of tricky all around the world. There's no magic way to do worker training. The countries where it's more just transfer payments that aren't investments in public and human capital, but are more just income offsets, those nations don't have as strong a productivity growth. So if you look at, no judgment, but Italy, France, the UK to some extent, you don't see as vibrant of economic performance like you do in some of the Nordic nations. Or Germany is a good example too. That's more on the high investment, high productivity and dynamic side.
That's an interesting distinction. I think that's important. I want to jump to some of the questions that have been submitted online. There've been several about what about the American dream differences by gender?
Oh, yeah, great question. Say more, Jim, sorry.
Excuse me?
So I think, let me answer it this way. We continue to have persistent earnings differentials for women in the labor market compared to men, even when you control for educational attainment and occupational choice. But even those things are deeply related to implicit and explicit bias and discrimination that women continue to face in the labor market. It's remarkable. So one example I will give, it's actually kind of near and dear to my day job as dean of the Tuck School. There's a study done by a couple of economists many years ago. They got data for another business school. I'll call it the Tuck School of Business of Hyde Park in Chicago. The world otherwise knows that as the Booth School of Business. They looked at earnings of men and women, total annual earnings at graduation, at like 5 years out, and then 10 plus years out. So they did a couple surveys of Booth grads. And the male-female earnings differential at graduation was approximately 0. So the young women and young men graduating from Booth, they were getting basically the same compensation offers. 5 years out, the pay gap had opened up to about 25%. And when you look 10 plus years out, so it's kind of aggregating together 10, 20, 30 years out, the average gap in earnings, women below men of annual earnings had ballooned to 60%, 60. And what they found was it was almost entirely accounted for by women who had had children that were moms. Women who didn't have children, their earnings looked much more like men, regardless of whether men did or didn't have children. So what that reflects, I think, and this good question is, we continue in the United States, at least, to have women provide more of the caregiving than the breadwinning. If I use that nice metaphor of Anne Marie Slaughter, who's a political scientist who was at Princeton for a lot of years, no relation. And it's remarkable. This study of high talent women who had business degrees showed the difference was women that had kids, they found it much harder to be in these high talent, high requirement, high dynamism occupations like finance and consulting. And that gets to a deep question of leadership. What are leaders in firms and what are we as a society going to do to break down the barriers that have existed for decades that make it harder for women to have the same kind of advancement and opportunities that men do?
This next question is sort of in two parts. In recent months, jobs are coming back, wages are going up. There have been those who are suggesting that this income inequality is sort of a self-correcting problem. I think you've sort of given your answer, but you might want to comment on that. And then the second part of the question is, and several people have spoken about, and you mentioned it, most of the remedies that you talk about cost a lot of money. And I guess the question is, can we afford it? So the first part of the question is,
both great.
The system is self-correcting.
Yep. No, so great question, but not to be oppositional, but no, it's not necessarily self-correcting. So the deep forces, again, of globalization and technological change that determine real and relative earnings, there's no kind of law of physics or law of economics that says it's going to automatically, in some sense, self-correct and the level and relative earnings we looked at somehow re-equilibrate. Now, that said, what this question is getting at, and I had us a slide that showed us this, was one thing that the research and evidence shows very clearly is when we run what's oftentimes, to use a heat metaphor, a hot labor market, who tends to benefit the most are moderate to less skilled, lower income individuals. The reason, I showed us one of those slides, I won't show it again, but if you go back and look at it after this talk, that lower income people had faster earnings growth during the Trump presidency. The reason was not necessarily who was in the White House or in Congress. It had everything to do in terms of the economics with the unemployment rate got to a very low level. If you recall before the pandemic, the aggregate unemployment rate was like 3.5%. Right. And we all learned there was a time earlier where people said, oh, 3.5% unemployment, you'll have price inflation that's too high. The Federal Reserve is going to have to tighten monetary policy, not to get too far into the weeds. But that wasn't happening. We didn't need to. Inflation was quite muted. And you had strong growth in jobs and importantly in earnings per hour and in total for moderate and less skilled people, for women, for Blacks and Hispanics. That was terrific. So I think the recovery in the pandemic, as the labor market continues to recover and overall the economy reopens, it's terrific, I think, to see companies having to bid up wages from $12 to $13 to $14 per hour. Now remember, there's hourly wages, but what matters for economic well-being is your total earnings during the year. So, and how many hours you have the chance of working. So there's some important measurement things that map to well-being. So the tightening labor market and the reopening from the pandemic, fingers crossed, is fabulous to address what we've been talking about, but it isn't necessarily going to magically offset these deep forces of globalization and technological change and the pressures they generate. So that's thing one. Thing two on the good question of, can we afford the sorts of lifelong ladder of opportunity that I'm talking about? I'll ask a provocative question is, you tell me, can we afford not to? So I'm a Tigger and I'm an independent, and yet I'm very worried about the corrosion of civic trust and the capability of the United States as a sovereign nation and as a to maintain the broad political will to have the broad system continue working. If sufficient number of citizens do not think or feel that the economic system is working for them and the American dream is reviving or at least not fading in the way that we talked about, I'm not quite sure what happens in this country politically. And we unfortunately see the divisive partisanship that's making it very, very difficult to make any progress on these things right now. So are these investments expensive? Yes. I will point out, we on the fly have chosen to run massive fiscal deficits last year in 20, this year in 21. If you asked me, did we need to spend that much as we've chosen to do in these bills that Congress passed and President Trump and then President Biden signed into law? I would have said no. I think we needed a lot of it, but not as much as we did. I think that the income supports were too generous for too many high income individuals and families. They didn't, because the trade-off is, economics doesn't know a lot, but it's oftentimes about trade-offs and opportunity costs. And in a corporate sense, what are your strategies and your priorities as a nation? And we've made massive fiscal transfers right now to offset income losses for individuals. I think we should have done much of that. But I worry that the cost is people say, well, we can't possibly do any more investments in our future because look at all the debt that we've accumulated right now. So I know those of us in this great conversation on average, we're probably most of us, if not all of us, above the median age in America. But part of how a society and a body politic expresses its values is what they're willing to do for the young. And if we're not willing to make investments in the future for this country and the young, I don't think it's going to be great. So, but what that means is we have to have some sense of fiscal stability. We cannot keep running up these deficits because at some point, the creditors are going to not show up at the treasury auctions at the prices that they will. And everyone who says otherwise is kidding themselves, because we have generations, if not centuries, of empirical evidence that sovereign nations, they can run large debts and deficits and accumulate debt for quite some period of time. But at some point when the confidence of the creditors is lost, the change can be quite fast and quite dramatic. So
This relates to a question someone has had, but do you think Elizabeth Warren is right in calling for taxing the wealth of the super rich and redistribute that money in some way?
Yes and no. Yes, I'm not a fan of the wealth tax per se. I am a wealth of high income individuals who are almost always are correlated with high net worth individuals paying more in taxes in a way that I alluded to earlier. Part of the problem with these wealth taxes is it is very difficult, as many of us know, to measure wealth accurately. And so fiscal systems that are simple and transparent tend to have a lot more political support and generate more revenue than ones that are abstruse and complex. So that's the no. Or sorry, that was the yes, I guess. But again, I'd rather focus on income than wealth. The other thing I'd say, frankly, is no, in the sense that for us to make the kind of investments we're talking about, we all need to get off of the thing we like to say, which is only the 1% that have to pay. Nowhere near. If you go look at IRS income tax tables, there's not enough there. Occupy Wall Street, that I very much appreciate and applaud that sentiment that was voiced of, we are the 99%, we need to think about the 1%ers. The data I showed us, I would have called it the 96.1% and the 3.9%ers, or approximately, if I remember the chart correctly on income. But to make the meaningful, sustained fiscal investments, and to be honest, to have all of us have a sense of civic duty and obligation to contribute to the body politic, no, we cannot just be focusing on the wealthy. That's not adequate. So that's why if we look at some of the nations we talked about earlier, their fiscal regimes, the overall tax burden is much higher, much farther down in the income distribution than it is in the United States.
Shifting gears here a little bit, Matt. The question is, how does the graying of America plus a declining fertility rate relate to the decline in economic progress?
Oh, great question. It matters in a couple of ways. One is the overall size of the U.S. economy of GDP, gross domestic product, which is, think of it as the broad tax base on which we can raise the tax revenues we're talking about. you give me an aging and slower growth population. I give you an aging and slower growth labor force, and therefore slower growth in output in the tax base, which, given the challenges we're talking about, is not great. And then the second thing is, what drives overall output is not just the number of workers, but the productivity of those workers. And there's a lot of compelling research, Jim Fire up in the economics department at Dartmouth here, for example, that have documented, on average, older societies tend to be lower productivity growth societies. And that's not a judgment. And it's not to say that people, as we're all getting older and hair's getting
Be
gray.
careful there.
Yeah, no, I got it. Don't worry, I'm aging just like everybody else here. But just there's elements of human nature and human psychology. People tend to be more dynamic and more promotion growth oriented as opposed to prevention oriented, and psychology and things is when they're younger, and that fosters productivity. So this is why one of the dimensions of globalization, for which it saddens me, for which there's overwhelming evidence that almost all Americans benefit from, is high talent immigration. Many dimensions of globalization generate distributional pressures. Again, David Otto is going to be with you all next week. He's one of the leading scholars with a co-author of ours and a dear friend of mine, Gordon Hanson, documenting what they call the China shock, the impact that China's accession into the global economy and their dramatic expansion of production and exports of low-skilled manufacturing, the pressure that put on moderate to less skilled Americans. But the research shows in communities and cities in America, you bring in more high talent immigrants, those who have advanced degrees and college degrees and are innovative. They tend to be much more innovative than even us native born Americans. They tend to start companies at higher rates. They patent at higher rates. Companies that hire them tend to hire more native and moderate skilled native born workers as well. And in the communities where there's more high skilled immigrants, you tend to see the wages grow more quickly, not just for other high talent native born Americans, but for moderate to less skilled Americans as well. So this question about the graying of America speaks to, it just saddens me that we cannot as a sovereign nation dramatically expand high skilled immigration. Part of the challenge politically is there's a set of stakeholders that they want to bundle together all immigration, and less skilled immigration is much more politically divisive because it raises issues of nationality, ethics, legality. It's a much more complicated issue than high talent immigrants. Those people are no less worthy as human beings, but our political process has not been able in Congress and the White House for decades now to kind of disentangle these two things. So whoever asked that question, when you're running for Senate, I will write you my campaign check contribution for expanding high skilled immigration.
Do you think that therefore our immigration policy should shift more to a skill-based, away from a family-based?
Yes.
criteria?
Yes. Now that shift, it doesn't necessarily mean let in fewer individuals through the family reunification criteria, but it needs to mean, I believe, soon and fast, a dramatic expansion in the total number of high talent immigrants that we bring in. The empirical evidence is remarkably clear on this. There's massive excess demand for high talent individuals from companies that are operating in America and from those individuals themselves. And the cost of that is simply less economic dynamism, less opportunity, all the things we've been talking about here.
It seems to me we've done a very poor job communicating that idea to the public on the need for more skilled immigration.
Yeah, and the other thing it would address, I agree, Jim, is we could create something called Heartland Visas that I'm a big fan of, I've written about. Some countries like Canada and Australia, not only have they expanded the total number of high talent immigrants, but to address some of the geographic pressures we talked about as one of the dimensions of the fading American dream, we could create new classes of visas for individuals who would agree to come to the Northeast Kingdom or the Claremonts or the communities all across our country that are smaller towns where the young are literally, they're graduating from high school and they're going away to college and they're never coming back. That spiral of lost human capital, lost property tax base, lost dynamism could be dramatically offset by high talent individuals that would move into those communities.
It's interesting because I think the general public often thinks, when they think of immigration, they think of the unskilled, I have to be careful, the type of immigrants that Trump and people were talking about. And so when you say more immigration, they say, oh, no, we don't want that class of workers.
And they forget Emma Lazarus's poem on the that's on the base of the Statue of Liberty about giving us your poor and your tired and huddled masses. I believe we should expand all kinds of immigration, but again, the economic gains, not that it's just the economics, is so overwhelming for high talent immigrants. Not that less skilled immigrants don't bring a lot of creativity and dynamism as well, but it's a different economic impact.
Let's switch to the technology and the automation issue. And one of the questions is, with growing automation and AI, are we looking at a significant decline in good paying jobs in the future? If so, what are the implications for the American dream? And I'm reminded of a study I think you and I talked about the other day from some professors at MIT that suggests that up to 70% of the rise in inequality came as a result of technology, and this was having a serious impact on low-paying jobs.
Right, and it has. So there's two things I think to keep in mind here. One is I'll say how technology impacts the economy given this talent base that we've been talking about, and then second, what happens when that talent base is expanding and you've got innovation? And I'll use the example of agriculture for that. So on the first, you're right, Daron Acemoglu is a great economist at MIT, one of David Otto's colleagues. He's done a number of recent studies that shows part of what's driving the fading American dream in the way that we talked about are ongoing innovations like creating robots and other AI innovations that substitute for kind of moderate and routine tasks that moderate to less skilled American workers have traditionally done. And in the near term, those jobs sometimes then they don't disappear in some sense. They don't get exported to China or somewhere else in the world in the way that the canard often has. Instead, it's simply those jobs are innovated away. And all the academic research shows that these types of innovations account for the large majority of job decline and some of the wage pressures in manufacturing and elsewhere. Yes, for example, there was a China shock, that was part of it, but that was not the biggest force driving a lot of the pressures on the American dream we're talking about. And if you don't have ongoing robust programs to allow people to continually reskill and retool, then those innovations can be net bads for a long period of time for lots of workers and families and communities, per the survey evidence I showed us. But the second point I want to say is, let's think about the experience of American agriculture over the 20th century. We've been innovating and being dynamic as a country as long as we've been a country, as long as, frankly, the force that has driven increases in standards of living for humanity over recorded history, almost all of it is technology innovation. I'm just figuring out, honestly, just harnessing fire and wheels and writing and the Gutenberg movable press and the invention of the telegraph and railroads and canals. If you look by industry, it's been dramatic, the churn and the destruction of some jobs and the creation of other jobs. In 1900, the decennial census for the United States that year, the population census, showed that about 45% of Americans, 45% worked in agriculture, mostly on farms and then food processing stuff. 45%, almost half of Americans. Today, that share, it depends on how you define it again, but it's about 1.5% of Americans today. So over that arc of 121 years, we've, quote, destroyed almost all the jobs and job opportunities in agriculture, largely because of the mechanization of ag, right? The increase in scale that you could have and the creation of capital that substituted for labor, all the things that people wonder about today. And yet that was happening at a time where over much of the 20th century, for ways that we talked about with universal secondary education, the GI Bill, in general, expanded funding, public and private, for education, different levels, some creativity with worker training and retraining, that job destruction of technology, innovation, and agriculture, those jobs got absorbed with new industries, new companies that were being created in manufacturing and in services. So there's always been this dynamism that technology innovation creates, where at the same time that it destroys some old jobs and occupations, oftentimes there's new ones that are being created along the way. And the ability to absorb and move into those new opportunities has a huge amount, again, to do with a theme we've been talking about the human capital, the talent that individuals, families, communities, our civil society and public sector creates for individuals to take advantage of those opportunities. So when I think about the future, suppose we do end up with driverless vehicles. Okay, most of those 4 million people whose occupation today is a driver or something, maybe all those jobs go away. And the question is going to be, what are we doing as a society to create more opportunities through talent development for those people to move into different new jobs? If we do nothing, okay. be ready for a very different political response than what we could do with things like building a lifelong ladder of opportunity.
So you're not a Luddite?
No, Luddites, I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation if we were Luddites. And again, globalization, Zoom is a company that huge amounts of globalization in it, right? In terms of the founders being from China and other countries, capital markets to fund Zoom. If
But
we're
the
going to be Luddites, then by definition, we're building walls too, and we'd all be out on the green and I'd be trying to have this conversation in paper.
But the challenge of those millions who might lose their jobs as drivers, for example, is that most of the new jobs, if they exist, are going to require more skills and higher levels of education.
Yeah, almost surely. And this is a great point, Jim. It's the intersection of globalization. The people who continue to seed into the global economy and the global labor market, on average, have less skills and human capital than Americans. No judgment, just a statement of the economic development of those countries. So those pressures on those jobs is going to persist, both because of innovation and because of globalization. So the political response for us is, what are we going to do for our fellow citizens to build more human capital, more talent, and therefore more opportunity and more of a sense of the American dream?
There was a study that I'm sure you're familiar with. I think it came out of Stanford University quite recently. And if I have the figures right, the research showed that a very, very small percent, something like less than 2% of students whose families were in the bottom 20% on the income ladder, and this is a study at 1,800 colleges, by age 30, less than 2% were in the top 20% of the income. Now, individual colleges and universities had better results than others, but it suggests that a college education may not be a very effective vehicle for mobility. Now, how would you respond?
Unfortunately, that's bracingly true. We saw that if you go back and look after this talk in the days ahead at the chart I showed us for average growth in real earnings by educational attainment. People with just a bachelor's degree only, not some sort of advanced degree, bachelor's degree only since the year 2000, their inflation adjusted earnings have fallen by about 5% in the US. So look, I'm an educator and I'm dean of the Tuck School. I believe that higher education has, I'm going to choose my words purposefully, a moral obligation to be doing a better job of delivering value for the students and the families supporting them. Or frankly, the political process won't allow colleges and universities to continue to function like they have been with a lot of the tax preferences they have and so forth. So we'll see. I have great hope. I will say, not to sound like a commercial, but at Tuck, we've thrived for 121 years because we're very innovative, because we're very cognizant, frankly, of running a resilient income statement that respects the tuition that students are paying and the investment that they're making to generate high returns, both financial and labor market, but more broadly as human beings. And higher education has to figure out a way. There's massive excess demand for students and families to gain these skills. They got to find a way through technology to expand access, and for those who they bring in to generate more value to address the statistics like you're citing.
But at present, we're all supporters of higher education, but very, very few, for very few people, is this a real vehicle, a mobility vehicle. I mean,
it's an amazing mobility vehicle for a lot, but there's a lot more people who need that opportunity that higher ed can present. That's kind of the challenge, I think, for higher education, is how to scale in some sense in a way that preserves the nature of the serendipity and richness of in-person interaction, but in a way that expands access and delivers more measurable value.
Do you think we're putting too much emphasis, or people who are concerned about this issue put too much emphasis on getting a college education? Are there other routes that should be supported perhaps more vigorously?
Yes, college is not for everyone, just based on who they are as human beings, their families, the randomness of their circumstances of life. That's why Ken and I are proposal for this lifelong ladder of opportunity. We have that second rung, which is we're convinced it's not adequate going forward for an American to stop their formal education at a high school degree. We think every American should actually get at least a 2-year associate's degree. And that's where better innovativeness and better sharing of information across the community college system would help us figure out which ones work well in terms of understanding the local labor market demands of employers and creating curricula in those community colleges that better match students with the needs in the local labor markets. Community colleges have long done, I think they've long had great aspirations and some success, but variation in that success in a way that I think the second rung in our ladder of opportunity could address.
You talk about the impact of this income and wealth inequality. There's a question here which reads, please talk about the role of rules permitting essentially unlimited political expenditures by the very wealthy and corporations, inhibiting and preventing essential changes to counter the dramatically increased concentration of wealth in the United States.
I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I'm not going to shirk the question, but we've got established principle that says businesses are legal individuals in the same way that citizens are, and therefore can participate in the political process. That's thing one that I'll say. Thing two, I will say is, I'm gonna say two other things. The second is, and again, I acknowledge I serve as dean of a business school. And yet, if we continue to think that businesses are only the individuals and those as collective entities are sort of rapacious entities that don't care about their workers and the other stakeholders, we are not going to find a solution to reviving the American dream. From the C-suite on, the individuals in these corporations, many of them themselves have benefited from the American dream. And I just work a lot with executives and boards and businesses. I acknowledge that. But it's remarkable how many of them are committed to what is commonly, and I think rightly called now, stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism, and have acknowledged that yes, shareholders and other financial supporters are an important stakeholder in understanding why businesses exist, but there's also workers, there's communities, there's suppliers and customers, and being more intentional about how to measure that. It's very hard. It's easy to focus on quantifiable financial measures like shareholder return. But if we imagine rerunning history, it's not that we should have monopolies. By the way, I'm a huge fan of robust antitrust policy, but sort of we've lapsed into assertion and anecdote about business and big business in particular. That is not going to help us find a way forward. We talk about business. A lot of people say small businesses are what really drives America. The overwhelming empirical evidence shows two things. One is the majority of innovation, kind of seminal innovations, come from either new small businesses very quickly become large ones, global ones, Google, Apple, Facebook, and so on. And second, a lot of small businesses in America, when you look at their income statement, their biggest customers that allow them to be in existence, meet payroll, and so forth, and grow are big businesses through the supply chain. So, and the third thing I'll say is, wasn't actually on it, but when I think about fixes in the spirit of what this good question was, I've become a fan of term limits for people in Congress. There's very few organizations that we don't teach a lot of cases at Tuck that say organizations should allocate power, kind of information, deliberation, decision rates based on age. Yeah. So again, I know we're all getting older, but a lot of other sovereign nations have very different policies around how long people can serve in the legislative or executive branches. We have that for the executive branch. We don't for Congress.
The several questions about what foreigners are thinking about this country today, and obviously the lure of the American dream has been one of the reasons that many people have come to this country over the many generations. Do you have any sense of how foreign countries view the American dream today? Are foreigners less enthusiastic? Are they seeing the holes in it, or?
Yeah, great question. Yes, they are. So I'll cite a few facts that's survey evidence, but just policy evidence. On surveys, the Pew Research Center, a great organization that does cross-country research, shows in some qualitative sense in recent years, it's not just a partisan statement. Again, I'm a lifetime independent. It's not just a Donald Trump effect, I'll be honest. People see the United States with less admiration than they used to. And in part, when asked why, they say, wow, we see a lot of fractiousness. We see inequality rising in a lot of dimensions. We see a sense that the country isn't quite working like it used to. Very resonant of what we've been talking about. That's thing one. Thing two, I'll say, and it speaks to survey evidence in my world of prospective business school students around the world. It's dramatic how in recent years, there's been a noticeable slide in the number of non-US MBA and other business candidates in their desire to come to the United States. In recent years, Europe as a group overall is cited as being a more attractive destination to go to business school than the United States. You see falling applications to American business schools, rising applications to the UK, to Canada, a lot of other non-US countries. So that speaks, I think, to a very particular group of the young and how they're assessing the world. And the third thing I'd say in this good question is, other countries to some extent, though they may continue rightly, I think, to admire the American experiment and the American dream and all the success of the United States, they're not waiting to see if the United States can resolve this issue of the fading American dream and how we might revive it. An example I'll give in terms of policies is, for many years, the United States, both Republicans and Democrats, were trying to create a new free trade agreement with a number of countries in Asia to address a lot of really modern issues on the flow of data across countries, more trade in services, how we think about labor, environmental standards. Donald Trump got elected. One of the first things he did in the Oval Office was he ripped up the plan to be part of that. And all the other countries involved said, okay, we're going to continue to go forward. And they signed and created this free trade agreement without the United States. And that, on average and overall, is a harm to American workers and companies and all the things that we've been talking about here. So I'm hopeful. Again, I'm a very optimistic person, but in some sense, the rest of the world, I think, decreasingly is going to wait for the United States to provide leadership internally and externally in a lot of these issues. It simply reflects the fact that with the growth of China and a lot of other countries, we're a smaller share of the global economic system than we used to be.
I'm told, Matt, that we're down to the last couple of minutes.
Sure.
But I want to finish with one question. I think we have a hard time trying to define the system that we're in. The unregulated capitalist system has the kinds of disadvantages you've been talking about. You mentioned socialism, and that's, we know the history of socialist countries, and that's a turnoff for most people. Bernie Sanders uses the term democratic socialism. It's kind of a turnoff. I wonder if you have a term that kinds of defines for people this mixed economy that you're talking about, of a vibrant economic system run by market principles, but with the kind of regulations and safety nets and emphasis on opportunity that you've described.
Yeah, great question. And again, thanks everybody for all these questions, and Jim for your synthesis of all these questions. I'd call it, I love words, so on the fly, I'd call it, our US system today, I think I'd call it democratic regulated capitalism. It's actually very heavily regulated in lots of ways. I think there's a little bit of this canard, which is there's no rules, there's no laws. We simply have a dynamic system, and you know, democracy per Winston Churchill is the messiest and worst form of government except all others. We have a system that has been delivering not as much of the dimensions of the American dream as we've been talking about in this great opening conversation for your summer series. My hope and belief is we can find ways to summon the will through the building of human capital, the building of talent, to allow more individuals, more families, more communities to participate in the way they want to in this democratic regulated capitalism system. I'm very optimistic. Change can come so quickly. We've seen it with some of the changes in the pandemic, tragic as that antecedent has been. And I'm hopeful that we're going to find new leaders and new ways to revive the American dream in the time ahead.
I think we're all very impressed that you are a Tigger. And thank you for your presentation today. And I think you really set the tone for the next 5 weeks. They're going to follow up on a lot of these same issues. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you to our speaker, Matt Slaughter, and to our moderator, Jim Wilson. We hope you have enjoyed today's session. Next week, we'll hear from David Otter, Ford Professor and Associate Head, MIT Economics, and co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research Labor Studies Program, who will speak about the work of the future, We hope to see you then. Bye.